Every year, on the eve of the 19th of May, the air at Blickling Hall, Norwich, goes ice cold. In a centuries-old tale, on this night, the spectre of Anne Boleyn makes contact with our earthly realm. The line between the spirit world and ours becomes ever more porous. The story goes that as the night falls on the anniversary of the ill-fated Queen's death, you can spot her ghost riding up to Blickling Hall in a coach driven by a headless horseman. Anne is seen, dressed in pure white, slowly being drenched in blood from holding her screaming, decapitated head. As the phantom horses gallop towards the great hall, suddenly they disappear into thin air. This gruesome story is one of many that have persisted since the execution of the Tudor Queen. Her restless spirit has earned the title of the most travelled ghost in England, a country notorious for centuries of horrible history and haunted locations. Blickling Hall, where Anne is believed to have been born, is just one of many significant sites that have become paranormal hotspots, even close to 500 years on. The Tudor era, under the tyrant King Henry VIII's reign, is remembered as a time of intense upheaval and emotion. The walls of the various palaces, castles, and stately homes witnessed reformation, execution, miscarriages, anger, and betrayal. The sites of this era and the subjects that lived through it are known to be highly active in the afterlife. Anne Boleyn is believed to have been born in 1501 at Blickling Hall. The ghost of Anne is the only part of the original property that remains to this day. She spent her childhood living alongside her parents and siblings at Heaver Castle in Kent. Her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, was a minor courtier who gained favour and esteem in the court of King Henry VII, and when Henry VIII ascended to the throne, he was created a Knight of the Bath. With a talent for foreign languages, Thomas rose to prominence in the court of Henry VIII. He became one of his leading diplomats and politicians, often sent on diplomatic missions to France. Through these connections, Thomas Boleyn sends Anne to be educated at the court of Margaret of Austria.
Anne was born a traditional Catholic in a traditionally Catholic family. But her father was a diplomat abroad and he was able to secure her coveted positions at two European courts. Firstly, at the court of Margaret of Austria, who was famed for educating women, and then also at the court of France, where Anne was exposed again to new ideas and new ways of thinking. This was a vibrant Renaissance court.
In October 1514, Thomas Boleyn arranged that Anne would attend Henry VIII's sister Mary, who was about to marry Louis XII of France. Though Louis XII dies only a few months later and Mary returns to England, Anne remains at the court of the new French queen, Claude. She makes acquaintances with Claude's sister-in-law, Marguerite de Navarre, a patron of humanists and reformers. She was an author and wrote many books on Christian mysticism and religious reform. Though these works land her in violation of the heresy laws, Marguerite's status as the king's beloved sister shielded her from prosecution. Many historians suggest that Anne's radical reformist views likely stemmed from her acquaintance with Marguerite.
Anne was exposed to these ideas which questioned the centrality of the papacy and also which championed the reading of the Bible in the vernacular, in people's own language. This really gave power to people to make their own decisions rather than having religion foisted upon them by a third party. So whilst these ideas may not seem radical to us today, they certainly were at the time when Anne was exposed to them.
It's 1522, and war between England and France is imminent. The 21-year-old Anne returns home. She joins the English court, where her sister, Mary Boleyn, has become the king's mistress, despite being married to William Carey, a wealthy and influential courtier.
Like many kings before him, Henry VIII took mistresses. He doesn't appear to have spent much time with them. They tended to be short and very discreet affairs, and Henry VIII tended not to acknowledge them either.
It is believed by many that at least one of her children were fathered by the king, and not her husband. But Henry soon tires of her, and Mary is discarded. Anne joined the royal court and is in the employ of Queen Catherine as a maid of honour. She turned many heads at court, garnering considerable popularity. She stood out from the rest of the court in her distinct French dress. Her wit and charm inspired laughter and spirited conversation. Eventually, she even caught the king's eye. He wanted her to be his mistress. Though it is said that Mary was the more beautiful sister, Anne was the more ambitious and intelligent. She knew that Henry wanted her. Having observed how the king abandoned his mistresses once he tired of them, Anne was adamant that she would not be the next.
She really rebuffed Henry's advances until she got to the point where Henry offered her a legitimate path, a hand in marriage, and a crown.
She knew that it was only through marriage that she and her family would gain the respect and power they desired. She was insistent. If he were ever to have her, it would be as his wife and queen.
She was not prepared to throw herself away as a mistress to the king. And part of the reason for this may well be that she has seen firsthand what happens to the king's cast-off mistresses, because her sister Mary Boleyn had been the king's most recent mistress. She was the king's lover for several years, may or may not have borne him children, and when the relationship ends and Henry tires of her, he simply discarded her. Mary Boleyn got very, very little from her relationship to Henry VIII.
Anne's home of Heaver Castle becomes the site of Henry's persistent courting. Anne receives countless letters from the king, who famously loathes writing, telling of his love for her.
Henry VIII bombarded Anne with a number of love letters. Unfortunately, none of Anne's replies survive, so we can only read from Henry's letters what those replies may have been, or certainly what Henry interpreted them to have been. We know that Anne at times doesn't reply to Henry's letters, and he writes afterwards to admonish her for not replying. And if I'm honest, these are the works of a lovesick schoolboy. He talks about his enduring love for her. He sends her the dead bodies of deer that he has hunted for her in the hope that when she eats the flesh, she will be reminded of him.
Henry VIII visited the Boleyns at Heaver Castle on many occasions. The courting between the two seemed genuine.
We know for certain by 1526 that Henry VIII was falling head over heels in love for Anne Boleyn.
There is no doubt that Henry adored Anne. He loved her deeply. In his letters, he talks about being struck by the dart of love.
Anne's ghost is known to roam her childhood home and gardens. However, unlike the gory nature of Blickling Hall, Anne here is described as peaceful. Her ghost is often seen at Heaver Castle around Christmas, her favourite time of year. She is believed to manifest under a great oak tree, where she and Henry courted. Other reports have spotted her silently drifting over the River Eden Bridge. Heaver Castle was the ground of happier times of Anne's life.
We are still looking at the Henry VIII who is young and good looking. He's in his 30s. He's still in his prime. He's only starting to gain weight. Still a real catch. So it's easy to see how Anne could fall in love with a man like Henry VIII.
Henry had become hell-bent on marrying Anne, but he is still married to Catherine of Aragon. Henry knows that to marry Anne and sire a legitimate son by her, he must secure the annulment of his first marriage. As gossip of an annulment tore through the rest of Europe, they all found fault in Henry's new infatuation. She was criticised and condemned as the courts of England and Europe were still impressed by the faithful and pious Queen Catherine. Knowing that openly flaunting his love for Anne for all to see at court could influence the Pope's decision, Henry and Anne dine privately together, and he gifts her the finest dresses and most expensive jewels. When Catherine and Henry were first wed in 1509, Henry had to appeal to the Pope for a dispensation to marry her, as, under canon law, his brother's wife had become his sister. The Pope granted this first dispensation, and the couple had been wed. But in the late 1520s, for the second time pertaining to his relationship with Catherine of Aragon, the king has to seek a dispensation from the Pope.
The only real way that Henry was going to be able to marry Anne was if the Pope would annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. And Anne and Henry knew that the best mechanism for achieving that end would be through the king's minister, Thomas Wolsey.
At Henry's behest, Cardinal Wolsey travels to Rome, where he petitions Pope Clement to grant the annulment of the king's marriage to the Queen, on the grounds that it was, and always had been, illegitimate.
Know that Anne and Wolsey had something of a tempestuous relationship. We know that earlier in her life, Anne had romantic attachments to Henry Percy, and we know also that Wolsey had broken off that match. And I think Anne retained something of a resentment towards Henry's minister. However, Anne was prepared to be pragmatic because she knew that Wolsey was the best mechanism by which they were going to be able to marry.
Henry wanted to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon on the basis that she had been his brother's wife. So they're related to within the first degree of affinity. They are, as far as the church is concerned, brother and sister. And his argument is that you cannot dispense such a marriage.
This will become known as the King's Great Matter.
What is quite ironic is that when he first sends to the Pope to request his annulment, his messenger also has a second request for a dispensation to allow him to marry a woman within the first degree of affinity to him. And this is because his sexual relationship with Mary Boleyn has created the same relationship between him and Anne that exists between him and Catherine of Aragon. So it's an ironic point, but I think it also demonstrates very, very clearly that his reasons for annulling the marriage to Catherine were not sincere, and that actually he wanted rid of her because he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn.
As a result of the sack of Rome in May 1527, the Pope is currently a prisoner of Charles V, who is vehemently against the annulment, as is Queen Catherine herself.
Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, is Catherine of Aragon's nephew, and he has told the English ambassadors that he will defend the Queen's just cause. It is an affront to the imperial royal family that Henry is attempting to annul the marriage to the Emperor's aunt, because effectively what he's saying is that instead of being his lawful wife, Catherine has been his concubine for the past almost 2 decades, and that is incredibly insulting to Charles and his family.
Caught between the wills of two powerful kings, the Pope delays his decision as long as possible. Wolsey returns to England without the Pope's annulment.
Wolsey ultimately fails to secure an annulment for Henry from his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and this leads to his dramatic fall.
Henry is furious, and Anne's rage is equally palpable, frustrated with waiting following a papal edict in 1530, in which the Pope orders Henry to leave her. To placate her, the king vows to move against Wolsey, and he makes her Marquess of Pembrokeshire. And her elevation to peerage in 1532 means that she now, in her own right, held wealth and lands. Enraged by Wolsey's failure to secure the annulment, Henry turns to more drastic measures. Wolsey is arrested and charged with treason, though on his journey to London for his trial, he dies. Had he survived the journey, he would likely have been executed. Back at court, Thomas Cromwell, one of Henry's key ministers, proposes a new plan to grant Henry's divorce: Reformation. Anne and Cromwell's shared reformist views make them indomitable allies, and so begins the break from Rome, fueled more by political affair than theological dispute. Having installed himself as the supreme head of this new church in England, Henry grants his own divorce and begins preparations to marry Anne Boleyn. Thomas Cromwell is appointed Vicar General and later Chancellor, and will be instrumental in the coming turmoil of the Henrician Reformation. As Queen Catherine is stripped of her titles and exiled from court, the new Queen Anne Boleyn receives a lavish coronation.
Now that Henry and Anne were married, Henry intended to present Anne to his country as his legitimate second queen. So he affords her an almost more lavish coronation than his own.
Anne is crowned with St. Edward's crown, which is traditionally only used for the coronation of a sovereign, and not a queen consort. Her court would be of stark contrast to that of Catherine's, as she spends ostentatious amounts of money on gowns, jewels, and furniture, and renovates many royal residences to suit her tastes. Henry's break with Rome causes the monarch to fall in the public's esteem, and Anne is blamed for her husband's tyranny and for having made him a heretic. She was often called the king's whore and was generally unpopular. This was accelerated throughout her short reign. New royal apartments were built for Anne Boleyn at Hampton Court Palace, Henry VIII's favoured residence. Throughout the next 3 years, symbols of the king and queen's love adorned the palace. Initials of intertwined A and H were inscribed throughout. The Boleyn coat of arms and carvings of the Boleyn falcon further cemented Anne's seemingly unchangeable position in the monarchy. A few short months after their wedding, Anne is pregnant. Court astrologers and royal physicians were convinced that Anne would give birth to a prince.
Henry certainly was expecting a son. We know that, in fact, because he prepares the birth announcements for the birth of a prince.
Henry had moved heaven and earth to marry Anne Boleyn, and the price for crowning her was the delivery of the much longed for male heir that Henry so desired.
However, in 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth.
Elizabeth was born at Greenwich Palace in September 1533. She's the first child of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, the first since the break with Rome. Unfortunately for her parents, of course, she is a girl, and the birth announcements are amended to add an S to say princess.
Although Henry was disappointed at first, the delivery of a healthy girl is celebrated as a good sign for the conception of future sons.
Elizabeth's birth was disappointing. He really did want to have a son, but he knew that both he and Anne were young enough to have more children, and Anne does quickly become pregnant again the following year.
Henry and Anne would continue to try for sons after the birth of Elizabeth. However, Anne's pregnancies would result in stillbirths or miscarriages. On the 8th of January 1536, the death of Catherine of Aragon had reached the monarchs. The news instilled an urgency in Anne, who, pregnant again, realized the threat to her position if she did not give birth to a son. The death of Catherine meant that Henry would be free to marry again without any fear or illegality. The same day as Catherine's funeral, Anne Boleyn would miscarry the son she had been bearing.
It was still not the end for Anne Boleyn. There were signs that Henry was still committed to the relationship. That Easter, for example, he finally secured the recognition of the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis of Anne's queenship. This was a high point for Anne, but she also had proved unable to secure her brother's election to become a Knight of the Garter, which again shows that her relationship with Henry was in decline.
Her previous ally, Thomas Cromwell, is said to have a key role in her downfall. Cromwell came to realise that while they possessed similar ideologies surrounding the Reformation, their methodology couldn't have been more at odds.
Anne's downfall happens very, very quickly, and certainly Thomas Cromwell is deeply involved. He had quarrelled with Anne in the weeks leading up to her fall. She'd been heard to say that she would have his head.
Following her miscarriage, Henry's frustrations had reached a boiling point. He no longer believed that Anne would be the one to give him the male heir he was obsessed with.
Henry told Anne that he could see that he would have no more boys by her, which was particularly ominous. Henry, by this stage, was involved with Anne's lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour, who had herself declared that she would not become the king's mistress. He seems to have promised to marry Jane before Anne's downfall. He wanted rid of Anne Boleyn.
Cromwell retreated from court, and upon hearing that the king wanted out of the marriage, he returned and fired directly at Anne's head.
Anne is arrested and charged with adultery, incest, and treason. There is no evidence for this, but Anne is tried, found guilty, and ordered to be executed. The charges against Boleyn are thought to be wholly fabricated by Cromwell as a result of their ongoing rivalry.
In truth, there was absolutely no foundation for any of the charges held against Anne. The simple fact of the matter is that Henry wanted out, and he knew that Anne would not go quietly.
Henry had moved his attention onto his soon-to-be next wife, Jane Seymour. He entrusted Cromwell to find a solution in order to end his marriage to Anne.
Moreover, he knew that Anne wasn't protected like Catherine was by a foreign power, and therefore she was much more easily dispatched than Catherine.
The apartments in Hampton Court Palace, intended to house Anne after her coronation, were still under construction when Anne was due to be executed. She would be held at Hampton Court while awaiting her execution. After Anne's death, Henry wanted her existence wiped off the face of the earth, starting with her impression at Hampton Court Palace. Her portraits were destroyed, the apartment initials were changed, and all Boleyn family symbols were removed. Although this was an attempt to banish Anne to the forgotten tides of history, Anne Boleyn's ghost supposedly spends many hours walking the corridors of Hampton Court, perhaps yearning to prove her longevity as once Queen of England. Accounts say she is wearing a blue or black dress and screaming. Sometimes, once more, she is seen carrying her own severed head. From Hampton Court Palace, Anne would travel to the notorious Tower of London, where she would meet her brutal demise. The Queen awakes alone on the morning of the 19th of May. The winter chill has given way to a warm spring breeze. From the windows she can hear the flow of the Thames, the chatter of crowds, and the cawing of crows. She writes a final letter to her husband, who signed her execution note. She writes,
"If ever I found favour in your sight, if ever the name of Anne Boleyn hath been pleasing in your ears, then let me obtain this request, and I will so leave to trouble your grace any further. With mine earnest prayers to the Trinity to have your grace in his good keeping, and to direct you in all your actions. From my doleful prison in the Tower, your most loyal and ever faithful wife, Anne Boleyn."
Calmly, she dresses with the help of her ladies. She leaves her room, winding down the stone staircase. Onto Tower Green and up the wooden steps to the scaffold. She addressed the people briefly and calmly.
"I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that, whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the King, and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never. And to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord, and if any persons will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best. And thus I take my leave of the world and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul."
But what Anne doesn't do in this moment is admit her guilt. This was expected of someone at the point of death. But Anne defiantly stated that while she recognised that she had been found guilty according to the law, she would speak nothing against it. Anne then was undressed by her attendants. She had her furs removed from her shoulders. She paid the executioner the sum of £23, 6 shillings and 8 pence, which was roughly 2 years' wages for a skilled labourer. Anne then knelt into the straw and one of her ladies blindfolded her. And she prayed, "To God I commend my soul, Lord Jesus, commend my soul."
In a single stroke, the executioner's sword beheaded Queen Anne Boleyn. Her decapitated head thumped onto the straw as her blood began to stain the scaffold. A cannon fires at the moment of Anne's death, ordered by Henry as a signal that the task was complete. Although Henry had planned every aspect of Anne's execution, he failed to plan the details of her burial. One of the women who accompanied Anne to her execution covered her severed head with a handkerchief. It is thought that Sir William Kingston, Constable of the Tower, made the decision to use a bowstave box as Anne's makeshift coffin. The box was narrow and shallow, with legend going that Anne was buried with her head cradled under her arm. Anne Boleyn first stayed in a royal apartment in the Tower of London before her coronation. She returned 3 years later, but this time she came by boat through the Traitor's Gate on the Thames. In the centuries predating Anne's bloody execution, the Tower of London was always a site of notoriety. Built by William the Conqueror as a symbol of dominance over his new subjects, the structure has served a wide range of purposes. This included as a palace, royal mint, and arsenal, to name a few. However, it was during the Tudor age that the Tower of London became the most notorious state prison and execution site in the country. As it was a time of political and religious turmoil, torture devices were used freely by Henry VIII in the Tower. This included the rack, a torture device designed to stretch the victim's body until their limbs were dislocated and ripped from their sockets. The Tower was famed for its shocking executions of notable people, including Queen Anne Boleyn. Because of the Tower's violent history, many ghosts and spirits are said to roam within its halls. It is no surprise that the site where Anne Boleyn met her end is perhaps the most famous for accounts of paranormal apparitions. Anne is usually spotted carrying her head under her arm. As if she had stood up after her bloody execution at Tower Green and picked it up immediately. In 1864, Captain J.D. Dundas of the 60th Rifles Regiment was billeted in the Tower of London. As he looked out the window of his quarters, a guard below in the courtyard caught his eye. He was acting strangely. He seemed to be challenging something in front of the lodgings where Anne had been imprisoned. Dundas described this as a whitish, female figure sliding towards the soldier. It is said that later the guard would describe the figure as a woman wearing a bonnet that didn't appear to have any head inside it. Puzzled by this interaction, Dundas carried on watching. In the courtyard, distressed, the guard charged towards the figure with his bayonet. The blade and soldier moved through the apparition as if it were made of vapor. In a state of fear, the guard fainted. At the court-martial, Captain J.D. Dundas's testimony and corroboration of what he saw that night saved the guard from a lengthy prison sentence for fainting on the job. Another account from the Tower of London tells of a captain of the guard on duty late one night. Out of the corner of his eye, the guard noticed a light flickering in the Chapel Royal. Remembering the chapel was locked, the guard ventured to investigate. From the vantage point of a ladder, he peered into the stained glass of the chapel's window. What he saw was a fantastical scene unfolding. A procession of knights and ladies dressed in ancient costumes were pacing the chapel. From portraits of Anne Boleyn, the guard recognized the woman leading the march as the Tudor Queen. Soon enough, the tableau seemed to dissolve into thin air, leaving the guard shaken and confused about what he had just witnessed. From Blickling Hall to the Tower of London, Anne Boleyn is known as England's most prolific paranormal entity. The nature of her traumatic death has perhaps led her spirit to remain on Earth, haunting the past locations of her life to this day.